Emma stopped mid-unwrap and announced something that made our entire family realize we'd been living a lie for 20 years. Christmas morning would never be the same. You know that feeling when everything you thought you knew about your life just crumbles in an instant? That's exactly what happened to me on what was supposed to be the most wonderful day of the year. It started like any other Christmas morning in our house. The tree was perfectly decorated. Emma had made sure of that the night before, adjusting every ornament until it was just right. The presents were arranged in neat piles, each wrapped with military precision. Our parents were sipping coffee from their matching holiday mugs, and I was already tearing into my gifts like a tornado. Emma was always the opposite of me. Where I was messy and spontaneous, she was organized and methodical. She'd been that way since we were kids. The one who color-coded her school supplies, who never missed a homework assignment, who made our parents beam with pride at every parent-teacher conference. I used to joke that she was the daughter they actually wanted, while I was the chaos they got stuck with. But that morning, something felt different about her. She was sitting cross-legged on the floor, holding this small rectangular package in her hands, just staring at it. The wrapping paper was already partially torn, but she just stopped. Her face had gone completely white, and she was breathing in this weird, shallow way. Our mom noticed first. She asked if Emma was feeling okay, if maybe she needed some water or wanted to step outside for fresh air. Emma just shook her head slowly, still staring at that package. Then she looked up at all of us, me, our parents, even our aunt who'd driven down from Michigan for the holidays. And her voice came out in this strange, hollow tone. She said she had something to tell us. Something that would change everything we thought we knew about our family. The room went dead silent. Even the Christmas music playing softly in the background seemed to fade away. Emma's hands were shaking as she set the package down on the coffee table. She told us she'd been doing some genealogy research for a school project, one of those family tree assignments that teachers love to give. She'd submitted her DNA to one of those testing websites, expecting to find some distant relatives or maybe trace our family's European roots. Instead, she found out she wasn't related to any of us at all. The words hit me like a physical blow. I remember my stomach just dropping, like I was on a roller coaster that had suddenly lost its tracks. Emma explained that according to the test results, she shared no genetic material with our parents. None. 0%. She said she'd contacted the testing company to make sure there wasn't some kind of mistake, but they'd confirmed it twice. Our dad's coffee mug slipped from his hands and shattered on the hardwood floor. Coffee spread everywhere, but nobody moved to clean it up. Our mom started crying. Not the gentle tears you see in movies, but this ugly, desperate sobbing that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her chest. Emma kept talking, her voice getting stronger and more determined with each word. She said she'd done more research, contacted the hospital where she was born, even hired someone to help her investigate. She'd found her real family. They lived 3 states away, and they'd been looking for her for 20 years. The worst part? She said she was leaving us. That very day. She had a bag packed upstairs, and someone was coming to pick her up that afternoon. I felt like I was watching this scene happen to someone else. Like I was floating above my own body, watching this nightmare unfold. Emma wasn't just my sister. She was my anchor, my constant. Even when we fought, even when she drove me crazy with her perfectionism, she was always there. The idea of her just vanishing from our lives was incomprehensible. Our parents were falling apart. Dad kept mumbling about how this was impossible, how he remembered every moment of Emma's birth, how he'd been there holding Mom's hand when she came into the world. Mom was asking Emma to please just think about this rationally, to not make any hasty decisions, to give them time to process this information. But Emma seemed resolute. She said she'd already made up her mind, that she needed to be with her real family, the people she actually belonged with. She said she was sorry for the pain this would cause, but she couldn't live a lie anymore. The rest of that morning passed in a blur of tears and desperate conversations. Christmas was completely forgotten. Presents sat unopened under the tree while we all tried to wrap our heads around this revelation. Our aunt didn't know what to say or do, so she just sat there looking stunned, occasionally offering to make more coffee that nobody wanted. I spent most of the day in my room, staring at the ceiling and trying to process what was happening. Emma came in once to start packing her things, and I begged her to reconsider. I told her that DNA didn't matter, that we'd been sisters for 20 years, and that had to count for something. She just hugged me tight and said she loved me, but she had to do this. By evening, we were all emotionally exhausted. Emma's ride was supposed to arrive at 7, and as the hour approached, the house felt like it was holding its breath. Mom and Dad were in the kitchen, talking in hushed tones about lawyers and private investigators and whether they should try to stop her from leaving. Then, at exactly 6:45, Emma came downstairs with her bag. She looked around at all of us, and for the first time that day, I saw her perfect composure crack. Tears started streaming down her face, and she dropped the bag right there in the hallway. That's when everything changed again. Update 1. I never thought I'd be back here updating this story, but what happened next was so unexpected that I'm still trying to process it myself. If you thought the DNA revelation was shocking, you're not prepared for what I'm about to tell you. Emma stood there in our hallway, crying harder than I'd ever seen her cry in my entire life. Not the controlled, quiet tears she usually shed when she was upset, but these deep, body-shaking sobs that seemed to come from somewhere primal. She looked at each of us, me, our parents, our aunt who was still there witnessing this whole disaster, and her voice came out in this broken whisper. She said she'd lied about everything. At first, I thought she meant she'd lied about leaving. Maybe she'd decided to stay after all, realized that family was more than just genetics. But that wasn't it. She meant she'd lied about all of it. The DNA test, the hospital investigation, the family 3 states away, everything. The silence that followed was different from the morning's shocked quiet. This was the kind of silence that comes before an explosion. I could see our dad's face cycling through confusion, relief, and then something that looked like anger. Mom just stood there with her mouth open, not making a sound. Emma collapsed onto the bottom step of our staircase and started explaining through her tears. She said she'd been feeling suffocated for years by everyone's expectations. She was tired of being the perfect daughter, the one who never made mistakes, who never disappointed anyone. She said she felt like she was living in a glass box, afraid to move or breathe wrong because everyone was always watching, always expecting her to excel at everything. She talked about the pressure she felt to maintain straight A's, to be the responsible one, to set a good example for me. She said she'd been having panic attacks for months, staying up all night studying for tests she already knew she'd ace, just because the thought of getting anything less than perfect made her physically sick. The DNA test was real, but she'd never actually submitted it. She'd found some fake results online and doctored them to show what she wanted them to show. There was no other family, no investigation, no one coming to pick her up. She'd made it all up because she wanted to see if our parents would fight for her if she wasn't perfect anymore. She wanted to know if they'd love her if she was just flawed, human, real. I remember feeling this strange mix of relief and fury. Relief that she wasn't actually leaving us, wasn't actually someone else's daughter. But fury that she'd put us all through this torture for what felt like a twisted psychological experiment. Our parents' reactions were completely different from what I expected. Instead of being angry, they both just looked broken. Mom sat down next to Emma on the stairs and pulled her into this fierce hug, apologizing over and over again. She said she never realized how much pressure Emma had been under, how their praise and expectations had become a prison. Dad knelt down in front of them both and started talking about his own childhood, how he'd grown up in a house where love felt conditional on performance. He said he'd tried so hard not to repeat his parents' mistakes that he'd created different ones instead. He told Emma that they loved her for who she was, not for what she achieved, but he realized they'd never actually shown her that. The conversation that followed was unlike anything our family had ever had. We talked about expectations and pressure and the difference between encouragement and demands. Emma admitted that she'd been considering dropping out of her advanced classes, that she'd been having thoughts about hurting herself just to make the pressure stop. That hit me like a truck. My perfect sister, the one who seemed to have everything figured out, had been suffering in silence for years while I'd been jealous of how easy everything seemed for her. We stayed up until almost 3 in the morning, just talking and crying and finally being honest with each other. Emma showed us her phone, where she'd been keeping a journal of all the times she felt like she was failing to meet expectations. Reading those entries was heartbreaking. She'd been torturing herself over things like getting a 96 instead of a 100 on a test, or forgetting to put the dishes away one night. Our aunt, who'd been silently watching this whole scene unfold, finally spoke up. She told us about her own struggles with perfectionism when she was younger, how it had nearly destroyed her first marriage and led to years of therapy. She said she'd seen the warning signs in Emma for years, but hadn't known how to bring it up. By the time we all finally went to bed, everything felt different. Not fixed, you can't undo years of unhealthy patterns in one night, but changed. Emma's elaborate lie had cracked something open in our family that needed to be addressed. The next morning, Boxing Day, we had a family meeting. Emma apologized again for the deception, but she also stood firm about why she'd done it. She said she'd been drowning and didn't know how else to get our attention. Our parents promised to help her find ways to reduce the pressure she was feeling, and they suggested we all work together to change some of our family dynamics. But that's when the next unexpected thing happened. Emma said she wanted to repeat her senior year. Update 2. The decision to repeat senior year wasn't something any of us saw coming, especially not Emma herself. She'd been accepted to 3 prestigious universities, had scholarships lined up, and was supposed to graduate as valedictorian. But sitting there in our living room on Boxing Day, she looked more determined than I'd seen her in years. She explained that she'd been so focused on checking boxes and meeting expectations that she'd never actually figured out what she wanted to do with her life. She was 18 years old and felt like she'd been on autopilot since middle school. The thought of going to college just to continue the same pattern of perfectionism and pressure made her feel sick. Our parents were initially resistant to the idea. They worried about Emma falling behind her peers, about losing her scholarship opportunities, about what people would think. But Emma had clearly thought this through. She said she wanted to take a gap year to figure out who she was when she wasn't performing for everyone else. She'd already researched options, volunteer programs, part-time work, maybe even traveling. She wanted to experience life outside the bubble of academic achievement and parental expectations. She said she'd never even had a job because she'd been too busy maintaining her GPA and participating in extracurriculars that looked good on college applications. I found myself supporting her decision, which surprised everyone, including me. I'd always been the irresponsible one, the one who didn't have my life mapped out like Emma did. But watching her break down had made me realize that maybe not having a perfect plan wasn't the worst thing in the world. The conversation with our parents was intense. They kept asking Emma to think about her future, about how this decision might affect her long-term goals. But Emma's response was simple. She didn't know what her long-term goals were because she'd never been allowed to discover them organically. She wanted to work at a local animal shelter, something she'd always been interested in but never had time for. She wanted to learn to cook, to travel, to read books that weren't assigned for class. She wanted to figure out what made her happy when nobody was watching or grading her performance. Our parents eventually agreed, but with conditions. Emma would need to create a structured plan for her gap year, with specific goals and deadlines. She'd need to reapply to colleges and couldn't just drift aimlessly. It was a compromise that felt very much like our family, still focused on planning and structure, but with more room for Emma to breathe. The ripple effects of Emma's confession continued throughout the rest of the school year. Word got around that she was taking a gap year, and people had all sorts of theories about why. Some thought she was having a mental breakdown, others assumed she was pregnant or had gotten into some kind of trouble. Emma mostly ignored the gossip, but I could see it bothered her sometimes. She did end up working at the animal shelter, and it was like watching a completely different person emerge. She came home every day covered in dog hair and dirt, exhausted but genuinely happy in a way I'd never seen before. She started cooking dinner for the family a few nights a week, experimenting with recipes and not worrying if they turned out perfectly. The most surprising change was in her relationship with our parents. They started having actual conversations instead of just updates about achievements and schedules. Mom began asking Emma about her day at the shelter, about the animals she was working with, about how she was feeling. Dad started sharing stories about his own young adulthood, admitting that he'd never really figured out what he wanted to do until his late 20s. Emma also started seeing someone, not a therapist, but a life coach who specialized in helping young people transition to adulthood. She said it was helpful to have someone outside the family to talk through her feelings and plans with. But the biggest change was in how our whole family communicated. We started having regular family dinners where we actually talked about our lives, our struggles, our fears. Emma's dramatic Christmas confession had forced us all to be more honest with each other. I found myself opening up about my own struggles with feeling like the family disappointment, about how I'd always assumed I was the problem child because I couldn't live up to Emma's example. Our parents were shocked to learn that I'd been carrying my own burden of comparison and inadequacy. Emma's gap year turned into something really beautiful. She traveled to Costa Rica with a volunteer organization, working with wildlife conservation efforts. She came back with a deep tan, stories about howler monkeys and sea turtles, and a clarity about her future that she'd never had before. She decided she wanted to study environmental science, something she'd never considered when she was focused on prestigious programs and high-paying careers. She ended up applying to a completely different set of schools, choosing programs based on her interests rather than their rankings. Our family dynamic had shifted permanently. We were still close, but in a more authentic way. Emma was still organized and responsible, but she wasn't performing those qualities for anyone else's approval. She was living them because they were part of who she genuinely was. But just when I thought our family had finally found its new normal, Emma came home from Costa Rica with one more surprise that none of us could have predicted. Final update. When Emma returned from Costa Rica in late August, she looked like a completely different person. Her hair was sun-bleached and longer than she'd ever worn it. She had freckles across her nose from months of outdoor work, and there was this confidence in her posture that had never been there before. She seemed genuinely comfortable in her own skin for the first time in her life. She'd been home for about a week when she asked us all to sit down for another family meeting. My stomach dropped immediately. I think we all had PTSD from the last time she'd made a big announcement. But this time, her energy was completely different. She wasn't nervous or dramatic. She was excited. She told us she'd met someone in Costa Rica. Not romantically. She was quick to clarify that. But someone who'd changed her perspective on everything. His name was Miguel, and he was a local guide who'd been working with conservation groups for over a decade. He was in his 40s, had 3 kids, and had never finished high school. But Emma said he was the wisest person she'd ever met. Miguel had told her about his own journey, how he'd grown up in poverty but found purpose in protecting the environment around his community. He'd started as a teenage guide, learned English by talking to tourists, and eventually became an expert in sustainable tourism and wildlife conservation. He'd built a life around his passions without ever following a traditional educational path. Emma said talking to Miguel had made her realize that there were so many different ways to live a meaningful life. She'd been so focused on the narrow path of academic achievement and traditional career success that she'd never considered alternatives. But here's where the story took another unexpected turn. Emma announced that she wanted to defer college for another year and return to Costa Rica to work with Miguel's organization. She'd been offered a position helping to develop educational programs for tourists and local schools. Our parents' initial reaction was panic. They'd been supportive of her gap year, but this felt like she was abandoning her future entirely. They worried about her safety, her career prospects, her education. They asked all the questions that parents ask when their child wants to do something unconventional. But Emma had clearly thought this through as carefully as she'd once planned her academic achievements. She'd researched the organization, spoken with other volunteers who'd worked there, and even connected with a local university that offered environmental science programs she could complete remotely while gaining hands-on experience. She showed us photos from her time there, pictures of her teaching local children about wildlife, leading groups of tourists through the rainforest, working with researchers to track sea turtle populations. In every single photo, she looked genuinely happy in a way that none of her academic achievements had ever made her look. I realized that Emma wasn't running away from her life anymore. She was running toward something that excited her, something that felt authentic and meaningful. The difference was striking. Our parents struggled with the decision for weeks. They'd come so far in understanding Emma's need for autonomy and self-discovery, but this felt like a bridge too far for them. They worried about her giving up the opportunities she'd worked so hard to create. The breakthrough came when Emma suggested they visit Costa Rica themselves. She arranged for them to spend a week at the conservation center, to meet Miguel and the other people she'd been working with, to see firsthand what her life there would look like. They came back transformed. Dad couldn't stop talking about the work the organization was doing, how they were making a real difference in protecting endangered species and supporting local communities. Mom was amazed by how articulate and passionate Emma had become when talking about environmental issues. They'd met Miguel and seen how he'd mentored Emma, how he'd helped her discover strengths and interests she'd never known she had. They'd also seen how respected Emma was by the local community, how she'd earned their trust and become an integral part of their conservation efforts. Most importantly, they'd seen their daughter as a confident, capable adult who was making thoughtful decisions about her life. Emma wasn't the scared, perfectionistic teenager who'd faked a DNA test on Christmas morning. She was a young woman who'd found her calling and was pursuing it with the same dedication she'd once brought to her academic achievements. Emma did return to Costa Rica, and she's been there for almost 2 years now. She's working on her degree through a combination of online courses and independent research, writing her thesis on sustainable tourism practices in protected areas. She's also become fluent in Spanish and has started a blog about environmental conservation that's gained a following among young people interested in alternative career paths. Our family visits her twice a year, and she comes home for major holidays. She's still the same Emma in many ways, organized, thoughtful, caring. But she's also become someone I never could have imagined. She's confident in a way that doesn't depend on external validation, passionate about work that feels meaningful rather than prestigious. The ripple effects of her Christmas confession continue to shape our family. Our parents have become more supportive of unconventional choices, more focused on our happiness than our achievements. They've started talking about their own dreams and regrets, about paths they didn't take because they were too focused on what others expected of them. I ended up making some changes in my own life too. Emma's courage in pursuing her authentic path inspired me to be more honest about what I wanted. I'd always felt pressure to be different from Emma, to be the rebellious one, but I realized I'd been performing my own version of a role that wasn't truly me. The family that sat around our Christmas tree that morning 2 years ago barely resembles the family we are now. We're messier, more honest, less focused on maintaining perfect appearances. We've learned to love each other's flaws and support each other's authentic choices, even when they don't match our expectations. Emma's fake DNA test was the lie that led us to the truth about ourselves. Her desperate need to be loved unconditionally forced us all to examine what love really means, what family really is, and what success really looks like. Sometimes I think about that morning, about Emma sitting there with that partially unwrapped present, working up the courage to blow up our family's perfect facade. It was terrifying and devastating and completely necessary. She didn't know it at the time, but she was saving all of us from lives of quiet desperation and unfulfilled expectations. Now when people ask me about Emma, I tell them she's living in Costa Rica, working in conservation, happier than she's ever been. Some people think she's throwing her life away, that she's wasting her potential. But I know better. Emma finally found the courage to live her own life instead of the life everyone else planned for her. And every Christmas morning, when we open presents together, I'm reminded of how much courage it takes to tell the truth about who you really are. Emma's lie taught us that sometimes you have to break something beautiful to build something real.